Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 222, First Manassas Redux. Last episode, we talked Stonewall Jackson and analyzed his performance throughout the war. As such, I feel like it's only fitting that we talk about the battle where he gets his famous nickname. That battle, of course, is known as First Bull Run, or First Manassas. Before we get into talking about First Bull Run here and redoing that battle, we do need to talk about some Patreon content. And recently we actually had some quotes from Stonewall Jackson. Kind of had that here as a change of pace kind of Patreon episode where we just kind of read a couple of one-liners from his quotes from a book that I had, and pairs very nicely, I think, with the Maxim sub-episode that we just did. And we're going to go back to our memoir reviews, and we're going to actually be taking a look a little bit of a different kind of memoir. It's a medical recollection for Jonathan Letterman, and Letterman was chief in terms of setting up the ambulance triage kind of system that the Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, is going to use. So he has a little bit of a different kind of memoir. So not only is it a little bit different in terms of the subject matter, because I don't think we've really talked too much about Civil War medicine and have it somebody of this kind of stature here and who had this kind of performance during the war. We haven't really talked about that. But also it's a little bit of a different kind of read as well. So I will be posting that shortly, and hopefully that sounds like it would be of interest to you. We have other memoir reviews. We have a couple more that we're going to be going through here coming up, whether that's a POW memoir talking about his time in captivity around Richmond, or whether that's also an individual who serves in the Army of the Cumberland. So that's another area that I think we have not had too much exposure to. We have movie reviews as well. We have a couple movies that are slated here to review. So if any of that sounds like it interests you, there is a link in the show description to the Patreon, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. So I know we did First Manassas way back toward the beginning of the podcast. You might be surprised, though, to learn that First Manassas was always kind of a dark spot for me. Many a night I would lie awake and say, wow, I only did some 20 minutes on First Bull Run. Maybe I did not lose sleep, so don't call me out on that, but the sentiment was always there. One extra time I would say, I should probably go back and re-record that one. The time was never right until, well, right now. The first major battle of the war is not only just the first major battle, but it also might very well be the first battlefield I went to as a kid and remember. After having run down the entire war and gone through all the major battles thereafter, First Manassas is also interesting because it stands out as this weird kind of dress rehearsal for the real thing. A real battle with real casualties and consequences, but a shadow of what, say, Gettysburg, Spotsylvania, or Cold Harbor will become. Both sides essentially do not know what they are doing. Volunteers have barely been trained. General officers only have the limited experience they had fighting in Mexico or against Seminoles or Plains tribes. They're probably clinging to Jomini or Mahan's lessons from West Point. We still have a glorified view on the war and in battle and combat, not like the actual horrors that we're going to see in later years. Could you even imagine civilians having a picnic within sight of the cornfield at Antietam? Everything is so new, we have guys dressed up as Revolutionary War soldiers like they're doing some kind of reenactment. Everyone is armed or equipped with everything, making for a confusing battle. These are the zealots, though, those who were pumped up to enter the war. As such, we haven't had the wear and tear yet. We haven't had conscription. For all these reasons, I think we can safely say that it is a sort of an anomaly and worth kicking off some of our redo episodes. Just as a note, I have a short list of other battles that I'm actually going to go back and redo here as we get into this season 2 of our episodes here. I think there are a couple more that I want to kind of go back and redo, and other parts of particularly large battles that I think I can go back and really hone in and focus on. So that's another subject matter that's going to be available here down the road. The Civil War, of course, is going to begin in 1861. From there, we have a problem for both North and South. There was not a large standing army pre-war, and the resources were limited. Remember, we talked about John Brown's raid, and the only federal force to respond was a company of Marines that was in Washington, D.C. Volunteers would be the backbone of the Civil War Army. Irvin McDowell had written that during the Mexican-American War that he disliked volunteers as soldiers, but he had also been utilized to put down immunity of volunteer soldiers, so his view might have been tainted. Certainly there were other general officers that had the same opinion, though. Even officers who didn't serve in the Mexican-American War, William T. Sherman has this opinion as well. As such, though, both sides would need to build up and train. Richmond had been established as the Confederate capital, Virginia being arguably the most important state in the Southern ranks. This placed the seat of rebel government extremely close to Washington, D.C. You could argue this was both good and bad for both sides. Washington would become the rallying point for the federal armies, and Richmond seemingly was in grasp. But with this proximity, it would give the rebels the opportunity to maybe get a huge early W. Lincoln, remember, would become obsessed with the defense of the capital because loss of Washington would give legitimacy to the insurgents. We might also have this view that foreign powers might see the Confederates as being worthy of maybe having them come in and help or intervene in some kind of way and end the war, right? And that's something that Lincoln just doesn't want to have happen. It might be surprising to note that First Bull Run might be the closest the Confederates would come to capturing the nation's capital. But the question is going to be, who is going to defend the Southern Heartland and maybe take a stab at Washington, and who is going to be leading the Grand Army to destroy the rebellion? Well, we have two officers, P.G.T. Beauregard and Irvin McDowell, that have similar trajectories, both having obtained brevet officer ranks during the Mexican-American War. McDowell had served with John Wool, the 1812 vet, who was also going to command Fort Monroe during the early stages of the conflict. Beauregard had found himself attached to the staff of Winfield Scott, where he served to distinction along with another officer named Robert E. Lee. This is also where he started the trend of not only seeking advancement, but also being slighted when he felt that he did not get the credit that he deserved. This would be an unfortunate theme for Beauregard as the war progresses. McDowell would be an interesting choice as battlefield leader. He had mostly served in an administrative capacity, first during the war and then in Washington, and he was an unknown, having to be elevated in rank to actually take command in the first place. Winfield Scott or Secretary of War Simon Cameron, or both, might have placed him in the lead spot. Scott, of course, had considered Robert E. Lee before he sided with the Confederacy, and Joseph Mansfield, who will meet his end at Antietam. Scott himself was probably more the choice to lead the effort, but he was 73 at the time and very overweight. There's kind of also this interesting conspiracy theory that Scott is going to choose McDowell because he knows McDowell's going to fail. You have that as a kind of something that gets thrown out occasionally. But really, I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind, and it's something that I've said in the main narrative episodes, is that you really don't have guys who are just going to be able to move into leading an army easily, right? You don't have anybody who is going to be experienced in commanding a large body of troops, including, large body of troops that are going to be on the scale of the Civil War, right? So Winfield Scott only had to command some, 10,000, 12,000 men in his push on Mexico City. And that's been so far the largest U.S. Army. So if you're talking in, your 30s or 40s, and then when you even get up into when McClellan shows up and you get 120,000 men, it's going to be quite complicated. McDowell would have divisions under Daniel Tyler, David Hunter, Samuel Heintzelman in the non-engaged division under Dixon S. Miles. Tyler had attended West Point, but he left the Army to go into manufacturing. Hunter, of course, was the stalwart abolitionist, and Heintzelman was Old Army. Tyler will have brigades under Erasmus Keyes, commanding Connecticut and Maine troops, Robert Schenck, commanding some Ohio regiments, Sherman, and Israel Richardson. Keyes, of course, is going on to Corps Command under McClellan. Schenck, who is the renowned gambler, was going to have Alexander McCook commanding a regiment under him. McCook is going to go on and serve in the sub-theater under Buell and Rosecrans. Sherman not only has the 69th New York, who will go on to serve in the Irish Brigade, but also the 2nd Wisconsin, who is going to go on to be part of the Iron Brigade. Israel Richardson has more Michigan regiments and an artillery battery under Henry Hunt, who's going to go on to do good work for the Army of the Potomac, specifically at Gettysburg. Hunter has Andrew Porter and Ambrose Burnside. Porter had served in Mexico, where he had fought a duel with James Archer, future Confederate general. He is eventually going to muster out due to poor health. Heintzelman has William Franklin, Orlando Wilcox, and Oliver O. Howard. Franklin has the 1st Minnesota, Wilcox has Hobart Ward, commanding a New York regiment, and I think we should recognize all the names involved here, right? Some of them are going to be rising higher than others, including Franklin, of course, is going to be kind of a McClellan disciple, so to speak. Orlando Wilcox in the 9th Corps, and Oliver O. Howard, famously commanding the 11th Corps in the Army of the Potomac, and then he's going to seek some redemption under Sherman, eventually becoming a wing commander. Miles, whose command is not going to be engaged, is going to have a brigade of mostly Germans, including regiments commanded by Julius Stahel and Adolf von Steinwehr. Both of those individuals serve in future capacities during the war. Beauregard is going to have brigades under Millage Bonham, Richard Ewell, David R. Jones, James Longstreet, Philip St. George Cocke, Jubal Early, Shanks Evans, and the nearly deaf Theophilus Holmes. Bonham was a former governor of South Carolina, but he had served against the Seminoles and in Mexico. He will go on to resign so he can move into Confederate Congress. During the battle, he would have a regiment under Joseph Kershaw, one of the better non-professional soldiers during the war. Ewell has a regiment of Alabama troops under Robert Rhodes. David Jones was a cousin of Jefferson Davis, who's going to die of a heart condition in 1863. Longstreet has a regiment of Virginians under Montgomery Corse, who's also going to be a future general. Cocke has Eppa Hunton and Extra Billy Smith, two more future generals. Extra Billy, also a governor of Virginia. Early has 3 future Confederate generals, Harry T. Hayes, William Barksdale, and James Kemper, commanding regiments from Louisiana, Mississippi, and Virginia. Shanks has the famous Louisiana Tigers, his being more of a demi-brigade. The reinforcing army of Johnson will have brigades under Thomas Jackson, Francis Bartow, Bernard B., and Kirby Smith. Bartow was a politician commanding Georgians, B. a West Pointer. Jeb Stuart would be commanding the 1st Virginia Cavalry, attached to this outfit as well. That is one of the interesting things, I think, about this early stage battle, is that there's not really a whole lot of cavalry, and that's because both sides kind of considered cavalry to be sort of useless. And there is an interesting view of how they evolved throughout the war. We've talked about it in our narrative episodes. We talked about it in some of our conclusion episodes, where the cavalry, especially for the federal side, goes from essentially being non-existent here at 1st Manassas to being a key part of the army, a key part of the Army of the Potomac, and Grant's push to capture Lee at Appomattox. So we just see that evolution. Earlier in the war, the importance of the Shenandoah Valley was apparent. While McDowell would be given the keys to the main federal field army and cross the Potomac, Robert Patterson, a former militiaman and mercantile chief from Philadelphia, would be commanding additional forces from Pennsylvania. He would be given the directive, however, not to bring on a general engagement. Disaster in the field was not something that the Lincoln administration would want to see. Cautiously, he would move his forces forward. Patterson was a veteran of the War with Mexico, but other than getting into the good graces of Winfield Scott, he had not really done too much there. Joseph Johnson, who had taken over command from Thomas Jackson in the Valley, would realize that Harper's Ferry could not be easily defended and look for a way to be aggressive in his moves. If you look at a map, the Manassas Gap would provide a crucial rail link between his army and that of P.G.T. Beauregard, who would arrive to take command of the Confederate forces known as the Army of the Potomac at that time. His army had set up defensively around Centerville, protecting the Manassas Junction. Now, the strategic importance of this place has been called into question, but Johnson being able to support Beauregard would be foremost on the minds of such men as Robert E. Lee. Both sides would see logistical issues, and McDowell would likewise be cautious. The main strike was perhaps going to be coming from Patterson, but soon the urge for a move from McDowell would be called. The actions in early 1861 were well documented and would add into the delay. Charles Pomeroy Stone would lead an expedition toward Leesburg. Remember, he would still be operating there in the fall of the same year where the probe at Ball's Bluff would occur. There would be some skirmishing along the Potomac with little casualties, although the first Confederate to die in the war would be killed in a probing action. Robert Schenck would lead an expedition to guard the railroad and be ambushed by Maxcy Gregg, 8 men being killed in that engagement. It would be these events that would potentially dissuade McDowell from moving, allowing for Beauregard to continue to prepare his troops. A move before the Confederate Congress officially met in July was seen as being on the short list for stopping the rebellion. In the meantime, though, on the Union side of things, McDowell could also get his green troops ready. This 1861 army would be characterized by small unit tactics. Essentially, whereas in 1862 there would be emphasis on cohesive action at the brigade and division level, this would not be the case in the army in 1861. In fact, the drilling of brigades together was kind of looked down on by such men as Winfield Scott. Scott, we know, was probably a little too dated to be leading the troops in the field, but it did not help things that McDowell was really not his first choice, and it is still a mystery as to why exactly he was tagged with leading. The old general, though, is going to unroll his Anaconda Plan, which will be adopted as the overall war strategy, albeit it would initially see some pushback. In June, we have a move at Big Bethel, which is really a skirmish, would be a larger scale affair in this early part of the war. Remember that a lot of people are thinking that the conflict is going to come to a swift conclusion, so there would be more fanfare surrounding these smaller engagements. The army is also very different at this point, because we have a lot of different motivations to joining. Generally, both sides would shade a little younger, and would be more keen on adventure than anything else. We have an account from a 19-year-old in a New Hampshire regiment describing this early part of the war. Our camp that night was at Bailey's Crossroads, and the march was resumed early in the next morning. Evidences of the recent occupation of the country by the rebels soon began to appear, for at various points the road had been obstructed by felled trees, the removal of which cost the pioneers much hard labor. At about 11 in the forenoon, the word was passed down the line that the advance had come upon a rebel earthwork, and that the chances for a fight were promising. The column was halted and formed in sections. For a minute, the ring of hammers driving home the charges and thousands of guns was heard, and then the column pressed rapidly on. We soon came in the sight of the work, a heavy battery of sandbags, but it was deserted. No cannon belched defiances from its embrasures, no bristling line of rifles rattled death into the advancing column. All was quiet as the grave, until we entered the deserted work, when shout after shout arose over our bloodless victory. Immediately to the rear was a camp of bough huts, which had been deserted in such haste that many valuable articles were left scattered around. About a mile beyond was the little village of Fairfax Courthouse, which we entered as we were becoming great conquerors, with flaunting banners and serried columns, while the bands played patriotic airs for the edification of the few secesh who remained. The brigade marched into the village green and stacked their arms, while the flag of the second was hung out from the most conspicuous places in the vicinity. The cupola of the courthouse. No sooner were the ranks broken than the entire brigade resolves itself into an army of foragers. So here we get a good idea of kind of this early writing where there's just kind of like a something that probably would have been a footnote in a similar journal later in the war, but it's really kind of exciting to be moving over works and it's deserted and kind of upset almost. The tone is that there's not really a fight going on because Beauregard is withdrawing in the face of McDowell. Neither side really wants to bring on a general engagement. The sides would be armed primarily with 1855 Springfield rifled muskets, meaning they had a decent weapon from which to start. Beauregard would face a tough task, though, of a mix of different types of weapons. One account would list that many were armed with knives so sharp that they were more likely to cause personal injury than harm to the enemy. As most of these men had served in militia, their uniforms would vary as well. Remember that these units were seen as more social clubs than anything, and a big draw was a unique uniform for parade. That's where you get the Zouave units or Revolutionary War soldier outfits. While most volunteers were thrown into infantry, probably the best units available would be artillery. Generally, these would be better drilled outfits, and 1st Manassas gives us some parity in the weapons. 55 pieces for the North compared to maybe 49 pieces for the South. Most cannon for the Confederates would be 6-pounders, with more of a mix amongst the Federals. Lincoln is going to meet with Scott and his advisors in July to discuss options. It had been surmised that some 25,000 were at Manassas, not including Johnson's command in the valley. Johnson had abandoned Harper's Ferry for Winchester, the gateway to the valley, and had checked Patterson with a skirmish at Falling Waters and Hoke's Run. This would be a real prolonged skirmish with Jackson's brigade meeting Federals on the field that would include future Generals Starkweather and George Thomas. The Confederates would stand defensively, and actually Jeb Stuart would force the capture of a large number of Union troops through a ruse. McDowell would now be in the lead and propose a flank maneuver, as was the fashion of the day. Several battles in the Mexican-American War had provided good examples of this. However, McDowell would be operating with a much larger army than Scott had commanded, as we already mentioned. Scott, to his credit, had decided to unleash his subordinate, originally also chafing at the idea of bringing the war into Virginia. Wagons which had previously been withheld from the Union Field Army would be released, and a movement would thus be planned. P.G. Beauregard had been a little skittish in the beginning, writing to Lee and Davis that he should attack with a small command and sell their lives for the cause. Robert E. Lee, though, had done a good job of filtering additional regiments into his command, so he was going to be on a little more of an even footing as the Union Army was expected to advance. To that effect, he would have a network of spies to inform him on the potential moves. Johnson would be wired, and his Army of the Shenandoah would be shifted to meet with the remaining Confederates at Manassas. Jeb Stuart and his 1st Virginia Cavalry would screen Patterson, who, to be fair, was outmatched in this regard. He was 69, having served in the War of 1812, and, as mentioned, Mexico, but he had never held independent command. He would believe that he was still holding down the rebels in the valley until it was too late. Patterson had a huge problem. A large majority of his regiments were seeing their enlistment periods expire. While Johnson only has some 10,000 men compared to his 30,000, he would be reduced to only some 3,500 in a short period of time. Now, it is argued that Patterson could have very well alleviated this issue by acting offensively. The troops gathered would most likely not have left the army if they were actively campaigning. Remember, though, that Patterson had been given the directive not to bring on an engagement. As it was, he would be chasing phantoms in the form of Johnson's army, and in a kind of preview to what it's going to be like under Little Mac, he's going to think that Johnson has a lot more men than he actually does. Now, part of the blame should sit with Scott for not really keeping Patterson informed of what McDowell was doing. Had he known that the other field army was, even at that moment, advancing on the Confederate Army of the Potomac, then we might have had a different action played out. As it was, the rebels were using the railroad to move to Manassas. Much is usually made of this troop movement, the first of its type, trains used in the Crimea only to support material instead of actual people. I have seen it thrown out, though, that the railroad was not really designed for this kind of traffic and was in ill repair. Thus, the march might have actually been faster for some units. But the key thing is that it is July and it is Virginia. So if you are having to march in the heat to try to get to your location and then fight a battle versus sitting on a train, albeit it's moving slowly, you're rested up and ready to go once you get to your destination. So there lies the true value of this movement by train. Meanwhile, McDowell's army would move cautiously forward on July 16th. Again, not wanting to make a big mistake was on the minds of many officers. The going was hot, and the troops were not accustomed to marching. Many had discarded their packs and had otherwise fallen out of the ranks to find food or water. We kind of had that in our account from our private from New Hampshire, how he talks about how when they get to Fairfax Courthouse, they kind of just break off and go look for food or otherwise any kind of valuables. So unused to marching were these soldiers that some had even ate the entirety of their rations before getting going. The Confederates would steadily retreat in the face of the Union Army, giving up Fairfax Courthouse and Centerville, but then stopping along a line at Bull Run Creek. Some skirmishing had occurred along some of the routes of march for the Union soldiers, but mostly there was not going to be any sustained fighting. Centerville had posed a strong position, but it was in advance of the main rebel lines, and Beauregard had been trying to scrape together his reinforcements, so it was deemed expendable. Several fords and crossings at Bull Run were protected by rebels, some in mind to maybe act offensively, the Creole general thinking he could hit McDowell in the mouth before his larger army was able to make their move. Along the Warrenton Turnpike, James Longstreet held his command at Blackburn's and Mitchell's Fords. Longstreet had thought that he might be relegated to an admin role, but found himself in the field instead. McDowell would wish to conduct a reconnaissance on the rebel line on July 18th. His plan was still feint frontal assault and then try the flank. Tyler's division would be called upon for this task, some 12,000 men. 20-pound Parrott rifles would lob shells at the far side of the creek, the rebels holding their fire until Union troops approached. Some Massachusetts men would be wearing gray, adding to the confusion. The rebels were well hidden in the trees and brush along the creek. Indeed, they were able to open fire at very close range to the Union troops, Tyler getting Dick Richardson into a position to try to drive them out. Richardson would press, but seeing a heavier fire would withdraw, regrouping to try again. Overall, Longstreet's ability to hold fire until the Union troops were within range was crucial. He had almost paid for it with his life, as Early's troops arrived and fired with some rounds hitting their own comrades, Longstreet having to dive off his horse to avoid the barrage. The rebels would briefly counterattack, with some accusations of bayoneting wounded men occurring. Richardson had tried to convince Tyler to deploy more brigades, but 2 aides of McDowell had arrived on the field, and thus he was obliged to call things off. The commanding general would be irritated that Tyler had exceeded his orders, the defeat being taken negatively by the troops. But Tyler had discovered the strong rebel presence on the right of their line, so it was not for nothing. 83 Union soldiers became casualties compared to 70 Confederates. We do have an account of this early action at Blackburn's Ford. This is from a member of the Washington Artillery that is there supporting Longstreet's brigade. Our commissary wagon had gone astray, and I was hungry and fatigued, but nevertheless, I slept the sleep of the blessed. Just before the break of day, I was disturbed by some one shaking me to wake up. I was startled for an instant, but I saw my captain, who had come to keep his promise. "Now, Baker," he said, "if you are in earnest, you having the opportunity this morning, get up and go over to the first company and ask for Sergeant Payne. I've arranged with him to take you with his detachment." The first company was to engage the enemy at Blackburn's Ford. I was soon with Sergeant Payne, and the company was in a jiffy to meet the enemy. We halted for a few minutes on the roadside, and as we were without rations, we filled our caps with blackberries, which grew in great profusion. Our battery was not long to tarry, however, for a courier dashed up and ordered the guns forward. Cannons were booming from the opposite side of Blackburn's Ford, warning us to be quick, for there was a serious work for us to do there. Excited horses with wagon loads of supplies were dashing pell-mell over the fields, ambulances scurrying hither and thither, picking up the wounded. All the animated confusion and the dead lying on the roadside as we passed the front presented a very exciting and harrowing scene, particularly to the mind of a young and inexperienced boy like myself. Just across the field, well up in the front, stood General Beauregard, holding a small riding whip, switching his trousers, as unconcerned as if he was merely a looker-on, when in reality he was directing the placement of troops. Our battery was halted for an instant behind a neck of woods, so we might select a commanding position. Then we unlimbered and the battle commenced in earnest. The enemy having gotten our range, we were literally pelted with shot and shell. We hastened to advance our position so as to get out of their range, and while their shot screeched over our heads, our guns were having a telling effect and doing great execution. I was acting as supernumerary on Sergeant Payne's detachment, and my duty was to carry ammunition from the caisson to the guns. George Muse, who I was assisting, would dive down in the caisson chest and hand me the cartridge. Taking it quickly, I would dash up to the front. On one of these trips, I missed Muse. I looked around and saw him lying on his back, with a crucifix to his lips and the blood gushing from his shoulder. I quickly bent over him and asked him what had happened. He replied, "Baker, I'm done for. I'm going to die." I tried to assure him that he would be all right, and binding a handkerchief about the wound to try to stop the flow of blood. I left him to resume the carrying of the cartridges alone. Poor Muse died that night. In one of these runs, I was suddenly brought to a halt by a stinging lick, which carried me to the ground, and I was lifted by 2 infantrymen, and little dreaming that I had been seriously wounded, I waved my hand for the boys and assured them that I would be back in a minute. So once again, it gives us a good idea of kind of the mindset. I really want to get up into the front. I want to see the enemy, see the elephant, right? And then we have starting of the realization that this isn't quite the picnic that you think it's going to be. What had been clear to Irvin McDowell was that he needed a new plan. A flank to the Confederate right would not work. Roads were narrow, the terrain unfavorable. No, he would need to shift to the Confederate left. It would be here that a suitable crossing of Bull Run could be made, a shallow part of the stream at a place called Sudley Springs. If we're looking at a map of the battlefield, we will find that Bull Run runs relatively east to west. The Confederate line is anchored on the right by Union Mills Ford and Blackburn's and Mitchell's. In the center is the Stone Bridge, and on the left is Sudley Springs. Matthews Hill sits to the west relatively of the Warrenton Pike, which crosses at the Stone Bridge, and intersects the Manassas-Sudley Road, with a stone house sitting at that intersection. South of the Pike sits Henry House, to the right of the Manassas Road, Bald Hill to the left. Beauregard, despite having to relinquish command to Johnson, would mass his troops on the right of his line. Even additional brigades of Johnson would seem skewed there. The reason for this would be that Johnson was unfamiliar with the terrain and would be giving operational control for the time being to the Creole. Beauregard would plan an attempt towards Centerville, convinced that there is also going to be a Union strike coming from Johnson. It's famously, Jackson arrives on the scene there where Beauregard is, and Beauregard's like, "Well, what are you doing here? Because I think you're supposed to be coming in on the flank and the rear of the Union Army," and obviously that doesn't really materialize. So we see the inexperience in and amongst the general officers in terms of what's happening. It's also, communication issues are also going to be a problem for the Confederate Army here as we get into the battle proper. But McDowell, of course, has other plans. He would come up with a complicated timetable, especially with volunteer Green troops. Hunter and Heintzelman would swing out wide to the Springs, come down the Manassas Road, and engage the Confederates. Tyler and Richardson would demonstrate at Stonebridge and Blackburn's Ford, respectively. This would hopefully draw the attention of the rebels, allowing for the flank move. Now, we are usually very critical of McDowell, but we can understand he is on a timetable. He does not want his army to dissolve without a fight as Patterson's did. Bull Run is shallow, but attacking across it under fire with the personnel he had on the field would prove to be a problem. No, it would make more sense to flank the enemy, albeit this would be quite ambitious, given that the Confederates would have the advantage of having their force combined on one side of the run, while the Federals would be split. Interior lines, remember, would be crucial for Beauregard as well. Another problem would be that they would have to march in the heat. When it does get underway, we do have an account of the march. Shortly after noon, a mounted officer came dashing out of the woods and drew rein where Colonel Howard was fidgeting. There was a sudden stir, a shouting of orders, and we started up the forest track. We marched through the woods and came to an open flat where Lieutenant Burt met us and told us, our commander, that we were to hurry. We went on the double quick, but a mile of this was all that we could do. The heat and the fretting of a long wait had weakened us. Men dropped, exhausted and fainting, by the wayside. Another mile, and another, we hurried on at quick time. This meant double quick at the rear, and we lost our stragglers. Men still on their feet and pressing forward threw away their blankets, their haversacks, their coats, even their canteens. When we got to Bull Run at Sudley's Ford, many stopped to drink, scooped up muddy water in their hands, their hats, their shoes, drank too much, were lost to service for that day. Not half the brigade, nor half the regiment, crossed the run. So that also gives us a good idea of just the inexperience of the march in general. July 21st would open with Federals beginning to move at 2 a.m. Artillery would soon start to trade rounds. But the problem would be that there would be confusion and delays amongst the divisions. Tyler is going to be in the way, delaying the jump off of the flanking divisions. Richardson would demonstrate, Miles would try to dig in. Now the troops on the extreme left of the Confederate line was the Demi Brigade under Shanks Evans. The 4th South Carolina and 1st Louisiana would be, for a time, holding their position even under fire by a 30-pound cannon. Despite the Confederate intention to act offensively, Johnson and Beauregard would both realize that they would need to stay put, as something was afoot. Rebels on the right flank would wait to be thrown in, including Dick Ewell, who would foray slightly in the direction of the enemy. Miles would not be doing too good of a job in holding any of the rebels in place. He was also a heavy drinker, who would be concerned that an attack would be imminent. Although Longstreet and Jones formed on the opposite side of the run, they would essentially stand by. As the soldiers were green, so too were the officers and the support staff of the commanding officers, couriers becoming lost, and some brigades not receiving their orders. It's actually one of the sticking points of the battle that a lot of people don't necessarily remember or notice is that Dick Ewell actually doesn't get orders to effectively call off his assault. So he might have had his brigade, kind of advancing alone while the battle is happening elsewhere, and it's very possible he would have been overwhelmed by Miles's command, because that brigade of Germans that he has is probably some of the better combat soldiers that the Union Army is going to have, because a lot of them were experienced having come from Europe. Tyler would likewise act in a more cautious manner than he had days before. This would be confusing to the rebels. Edward Porter Alexander, who will go on to be a capable artillery officer, had set up a signal station as part of his assignment on the staff of Beauregard. He would notice that the flanking force had advanced along the Warrenton Pike and then turned off-road to move in the direction of the Springs. Federals would become lost on the way there, as the going was quite difficult. To Evans, Alexander would report, "Look out on your left, you are turned." Fortunately, Bartow, Bee, and Jackson were all in hand to provide additional support. Evans would set up defensively on Matthews Hill, leaving only 4 companies to check the bridge. Here the battle would begin in earnest, as the Federals appeared. Ambrose Burnside's lead brigade would become involved in a fight very quickly, and with a surprising resolute defense, given the small number of men. We have an account of the fighting for Matthews Hill. General Hunter's column, to which Colonel Burnside's brigade was attached, was the right of the advancing line, and soon after sunrise the report of heavy guns to the left told us that the work of the day had commenced. Steadily, however, the column pushed on, but with frequent halts, until Sudley Church was reached, where a short stop was made in the shade of the thick foliage of the trees in the vicinity of the church. The battery was following the 2nd Rhode Island, a portion of which was deployed as skirmishers, and contrary to the custom of throwing them, the skirmishers well in advance, they moved directly on the flanks of the column. Suddenly, the outposts of the enemy opened fire, which to our inexperienced ears sounded like the explosion of several bunches of firecrackers. Immediately after came the order, "Forward your battery." Although the order was distinctively heard by both officers and men of the battery, I have never believed that it was definitely known whether it was given by General McDowell or General Hunter. with most commendable promptness, but without the caution which a battery commander learns to observe only by experience. Captain Reynolds rushed his battery forward, at once at the sharp gallop. The road at this point was skirted by woods, but a short distance beyond, the battery emerged upon an open field, and at once went into position and opened fire. The battery was now considerably advanced of the infantry, and could easily have been captured and taken from the field by the enemy, before the supporting infantry were formed in line of battle. And 2 years later, under the same circumstances, the entire battery would have been lost, when neither side hardly understood the rudiments of war. When we reached the open field, the air seemed to be filled with myriads of serpents, which was the sound of the bullets passing through it. Above us and around us, on every side, they seemed to be hissing, writhing, and twisting. I have been under many a hot fire, but I don't think in nearly 4 years' experience I have ever heard so many bullets in such a short place of time. Once again, the theme is always going to be with these that there is a little bit of inexperience there, and even the author kind of points that out, but it also gives us kind of the direness of needing to get on the field, deploy your artillery. This needs to happen quickly because obviously it's not happening fast enough for McDowell, right? Evans would perform well on this day, having his men lay down an effective fire that would wound David Hunter, sending him from the field, and shoot Burnside's horse from under him. Famously, he would buy time with an attack by the 1st Louisiana, the Tiger Zouaves, whose commander was the colorful Rob Wheat. Wheat would be severely wounded in this action, a ball passing through his lungs and out the other side, while leading a sort of sortie ahead of the rebel lines. The fighting was indeed fairly fierce here, and the Palmetto and Pelican Staters would have to deal with artillery under Charles Griffin and James Ricketts, 2 future generals. Evans has usually been lauded with his performance on the day, and for what it is worth, he does a decent job. However, I've seen it pointed out that he might have also just withdrawn his troops instead of bringing on the general engagement. Now, there's a lot of back and forth on this. Some people I have seen point out that it would have been difficult for him to do that under fire, probably. He's already taking fire from across the creek, and all of a sudden there are all these Union troops who are coming in on his flank, so it would have been probably difficult to do that. But at the same time, given the inexperience of everybody, it's not like they would have necessarily been able to capitalize very quickly either. So there's kind of this back and forth there. After an hour of holding off the advancing troops under Hunter and Heintzelman, Confederate reinforcements would finally arrive. Not only were Bartow and Bee present to lend a hand, but additional artillery under John M. Bowdoin, future capable cavalry leader in the valley, would also arrive. The added Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia troops would fall into line with Evans. With the added weight, they would launch an attack on the enemy, moving down Matthews Hill at the brigades of Burnside and Andrew Porter. Famously, Bernard Bee would call out, "Up, Alabamians!" He had taken control of the situation, and actually would surmise, even with the added reinforcement, he would need to strike out at the growing number of Federals. The Rhode Island troops in particular would be taking heavy casualties, Burnside calling for reinforcements of his own. John Slocum, colonel of one of the regiments, would be killed trying to get his men across the fence. Porter had some regular troops, including a couple of companies commanded by George Sykes, future 5th Corps Division and Corps Commander. They had moved to plug a gap in the Federal line. Porter had taken control of the division. Hunter had been wounded and would be criticized by some for his actions, which included throwing in the regulars when he did. Obviously, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell on the field at the time, right? But obviously, your regulars, the professional soldiers that you have, are going to be the best troops on the field. And they actually proved that on the day that they are most likely the best forces. Now, there's not a whole lot of them, right? Because remember, there's not really a huge standing army in the United States prior to the war. But you do have this kind of trump card that you could throw out there. And if you're engaging them too early, they're going to be spent. They're going to have to reload, get new ammunition. They're going to be tired by the end of the day. So having to hold them in reserve might have been the more prudent course of action. But of course, everyone's inexperience. It's really hard to tell. Ultimately, the attack is going to be checked by the Federals, the Confederates being forced back up the hill. We have an account from Bartow's brigade. Our colonel rode along in front of a beautiful white horse. He rode up and down leisurely in front, as if he wished to find out what a Yankee battery on the other elevation meant by shelling us, and that he was not afraid. Several shells burst over and around us, and pieces knocked up the dirt. I was thinking of what my father written to me to bear in mind, the old saying, to keep your powder dry and trust in the Lord. One of these shells fell close to me, burying the ground, and went exploding, leaving a good-sized hole. For a good few minutes I confessed that I did not wish that I was a ground squirrel or a possum, so I could get into that hole. This desire lasted a very short time, and I was baptized and never had any more fear, keeping cool and in some way enjoying the sport or excitement. The colonel did not think, evidently, that we could take the battery of 6 guns in the front, and so we went down the hill and across the field with a rail fence in the middle, and another at the edge of the thicket of young pines and blackberry bushes. Company A was at the head of the regiment. I was among the first ranks. We were rushing up the side of an old wash out in a rather steep. I remember being much amused at Schofield, who was in the rank ahead of me. In the rush I stepped twice on the heels of his shoes. He became angry and, still advancing, turned his head and shouted to me that if I trod on his heels again, he would knock me down with the butt of his gun. It struck me as comical when we were going into the expected wounds or death. The pine thicket was one might call an old sage field, grown up in young pines and in thick blackberry bushes, extended some several hundred yards, and then came to a point in another field, forming thus a triangle, with the base and the gully past. Inside this, there was still another old cross fence of rails. I was trying to tear it down when the procession behind of the stout men threw me into the briars. Struggling up as I could not get my place in the ranks, again I tried to get over the fence. In my company was a short, chunky, red-faced and freckled, with hair of a flaming red, of good nature, whom we called Coon Mitchell. I got one of my legs over the rail when Coon climbed up beside me. The rail broke, and I went backwards, wrenched myself fierce, and in a few minutes was getting over again. When what should I see but Coon's red head slowly rise out of the griefy-lean bushes. He must have fallen on his head, as he was dazed. He stared around and shook himself, and then cried out, "Boys, where am I hit?" It was so ludicrous that I could not help laughing, so that I lost a few more minutes. I rushed into my position in the ranks, which was drawn up at the edge of the thicket, and also already had commenced firing at the Yankees across a field, with a fence just in front of them. I could not get into my place as the field was closed, and then I asked the lieutenant, could I go to the extreme front? He agreed. When we got there some 50 yards, I had gone too far, so I concluded to go shooting on my own private account, as I had been trained in the Zouave drill. I decided this would be the best to begin with. In this drill, you shoot from the knee, turn over under your back, and roll the gun. I did not take any especial aim, except to the line of bluecoats, which I could see well. Before my last shot was loaded on my back, a bullet passed close to my head. It happened to be just loaded, and as swinging into position, I saw a large man who had thrown down the fence in advance. I took him for to be the fellow who came close to kill me, and I took good aim at a bright brass button on his bluecoat. He fell. There were others shooting, but I think I killed him. At least I did then, and turned over to load again, taking off my hat, and shouting, "Boys, I got one anyway." I looked around, and I was all alone. So it gives us a good account of the action and just how chaotic and green the fighters are, right? Irvin Cadell had decided that it was time for Daniel Tyler's division to move across at the Stone Bridge and make for Matthews Hill. Leading the way would be Comp Sherman's command, the 69th New York future Irish Brigade Regiment, making it into the fight. Sherman had troops that wore some gray, so upon approach, the 4th Alabama would believe that these were friendlies. A volley would soon prove them otherwise, the commander of the brigade falling and the troops put to rout. All along the line, the rebel defense was crumbling. We have an account of the Southerners wavering on Matthews Hill. Bartow vociferated to the captain of the Atlanta Grays, "We must get these men out of here." Several times he ordered us to fall back, but I was among those who did not hear. Nothing could be understood in the din which our ears were so new. But some of the men at last, misunderstanding the order to fall back, began a disorderly retreat. On the right of the first platoon, close behind it, I was encouraging some of the men of our company to fire with more coolness, and remind them that the enemy's fire was slackening. The regiment furthest to us had disappeared, its smoothbores probably being no match for the Mississippi Rifles of Company K, and the line before us looked thinner along the fence, and there was nobody standing to the side of it. Ransom, one of my men, lying on the ground, was keeping his musket quiet. He seemed very cool, and with much mirth I asked him why he had ceased to fire. He fired at once, began to load, and shouted at me that he had been obeying orders, and that he rolled his eyes in such a manner that I glanced to the left and to the right. There everybody was going back. Quick time. Of course I could not stay. I carried off my squad very doggedly. Their sullenness increased mine. At every step they seemed on the point of rushing back, and some would turn and fire. I think this is also a good time to kind of point this out, and it's actually why I really included this quote here in the episode, is that a lot of times there is kind of a debate in this battle of what happens and when it happens and who does it, right? Well, as we can see from this, like, most of the brigade has fallen back, but these guys are still there. So it's difficult to understand exactly who is making up some of these commands as the battle progresses. When does these things happen? It's kind of hard to tell when the timeline is. So you get the idea just from this one quote of just how confusing this first action is. Heintzelman had pressed on the defenders, throwing his command into the fray and attempting to flank at one point. But by that time, Sherman had arrived, and it was an overwhelming force for the Confederates to continue to stand. It grew increasingly apparent that the battle was unfolding on the Confederate left flank. Johnson is going to ride off to join the fight. Out of his character, he would call out that the battle was there, and he was riding to it. Beauregard would start to shift brigades, Holmes, Early, and Bonham toward the fight. 3 he would leave on their side of the run to check Miles. McDowell, for his part, was sensing victory. The brigades at Matthews Hill had retreated in disorder, and now his combined strength was moving up to roll the enemy. Wade Hampton and his legion would arrive and set up at the Robinson's house, close to the Henry house on the hill. Hampton, who would go on to become one of the better cavalry officers of the war, had come up from Richmond as part of the greater calling for reinforcements. They would immediately become engaged against desperate odds. We have an account of their part of the action. It was in a little kind of hollow, just in a situation well calculated to be cut into pieces. Well, there I happened to look over toward the battery and saw the puff of a cannon in our direction. I kept my eye in that direction, and in a few seconds saw the ball coming exactly where I was standing. By stepping aside to the left, the ball missed me, killing 3 of my company and cutting off my 3rd lieutenant's right foot. By order of Company H, and then filed to the right and took up our positions and rode about 50 yards from there. By that time, the enemy is near enough to open fire. We were ordered to do so, and at the same time the enemy opened on us with their muskets. So we were exposed to a heavy fire from both artillery and musketry. Well, according to orders, we opened on them, every man firing along as fast as he could. My first shot fell about 200 yards too short. My second, I aimed a little high. I got about 100 yards nearer. My third, I aimed still higher and got within a few yards of them. My fourth and fifth were aimed a little above their heads, and I saw neither of them strike the ground. So I took it for granted that they went into the enemy ranks. They then retreated into some of the woods that was near, and an increasing column of regulars advanced on us in beautiful style, at double quick, and passed in on heavy fire on us. We were to lie down in the ditch instantly. Every man dropped down, and the bullets of cannon and muskets whistled over it by thousands. As soon as they had passed, I asked the captain if we might commence firing again. He told us to pitch in, and we all jumped up and commenced at them again. This made my 6th shot, and just as my gun exploded, the rebound threw me back a little. A rifle bullet crushed the bridge of my nose, knocking me down, and stunning me for a few seconds. As soon as I recovered, I jumped up and began loading again, the blood all the time flowing from my nose. It so completely exhausted me that I had not strength left to draw my ramrod. I gave it up and sucked down on the ground, almost ready to faint. And in that condition, I concluded that the best place for me to be was the hospital. So I started for it, and finally reaching it, tried to get the flow of blood stopped, but the surgeon hadn't time to attend me, and told me to retire to some woods. I did so in the company with David Dubose, who was wounded in the right shoulder and lost no blood, and was able to get on faster than I could. So that actually gives us a pretty good idea of just how fierce the fighter is on the Hampton Legion and how kind of desperate the situation is, where they're having to be put in a situation where they stem the tide of the advancing Union forces. While taking on heavy casualties, the Union advance was temporarily halted. Burnside would march his brigade to refit as they were running low on ammunition. While the Rhode Islanders did perform well on Matthews Hill, there is an issue with them simply quitting the field. Unfortunately, if you are Irvin McDowell, you kind of blow it here. You add the Confederates on the run, and a concentrated effort would have definitely made it difficult for the Southerners to come out victorious. Despite the complicated nature of the attack plan, he is more or less exactly where he wanted to be. At this point, of course, we have the most famous incident of the battle. Thomas Jackson is going to move his brigade and batteries to Henry House Hill. They will be in a position lying down and be concealed, allowing for the Federals to get up the hill before taking fire at close range. John and Bowdoin had originally had his guns on the hill, but they were taking heavy fire, with many of their horses dead, so there was a fear of hauling the pieces away. And Bowdoin would stay for Jackson, actually having a round fall near him, becoming deaf in his ear as a result. Bernard B. would ride down to meet Jackson, who proposed to stop the enemy by giving them the bayonet. B. would ride back to parts of the 4th Alabama to hopefully convince them to turn and stand with the Virginians. Now, we can understand that Bernard B. is probably frustrated with Jackson. That's kind of part of it, is that he had asked that Jackson move his command up to stand with his men to help them in the position that they had previously been in once they had been pushed off of Matthews Hill. Jackson realizes that that terrain is not advantageous. He realizes that where he is actually probably the best spot for him to be. So he is going to decline and say he's going to stay where he is. And so that's probably frustrating to somebody like B, who's watching his command get chopped up. So definitely adds into maybe the lore of what comes next here. Because we don't really know exactly what Bernard B. says and what his intention was by saying it, as he is going to be shot in the head while leading troops back to the field. We do have an eyewitness of this part of the battle. It was now about 2 o'clock. The enemy were preparing to advance with fresh troops over our line of retreat. General B., very much depressed at the unfortunate turn to the affairs, then proceeded to collect his scattered forces. Riding up to the 4th Alabama, he inquired, "What regiment is this?" Captain Richard Clark, or Captain Porter King, quickly replied, "Why, General, don't you know your own men? This is what is left of the 4th Alabama." After saying that this was the only part of his command he had been fortunate enough to find, and he said, "Come with me and go yonder, where Jackson stands like a stone wall." As soon as the water detail which had been sent out returned, and the men had been satisfied with their thirst, the regiment fell into line and followed General B. to support General Jackson. While getting into position with his battery, Lieutenant John Pelham, commanding Albertus's battery, cut the regiment at the center to pass through. When the 2 battalions joined, it was learned that our beloved and gallant leader, General B., had fallen severely wounded. Singular Union regiments would be sent in their assaults on the Confederates instead of a concentrated effort. This, of course, is not going to produce the desired effect. In another inexplicable move, McDowell would allow for his batteries under Griffin and Ricketts to move into position on Henry House Hill. On the hill, they were supposed to be supported by the 11th New York, the Fire Zouaves, but the 11th New York was hustled to get there. They would be pinned down for the time being. We have an account of the charge of the batteries. This is going to come from the Confederate perspective. After taking our position to the left of the brigade, we laid upon the ground, listening to the musketry and cannonading going on to our front. Or rather, somewhat in our front or our right, from the Confederate force, which was being vigorously responded to by the Yankees. The Henry House was in front of our brigade, over the hill, the upper part of the house visible, and the Robinson House was to the right of that a few hundred yards. Occasional shells would explode over the regiment, and the solemn wonderment written on the faces of the men as they would crane their necks around to look for falling branches was almost amusing. I was near the left flank of the regiment, a few steps in rear, where, upon the formation of the regiment in the line of battle, I belonged. Doubtless I wished I was home, but I had to stick. I remembered an elderly man riding leisurely by towards the left and rear of us, apparently giving orders. Someone, possibly myself, asked him who he was. He turned his horse over and said, "I'm Colonel Smith, otherwise Governor Smith, otherwise Extra Billy Smith." It was in fact Colonel Smith, a game old fellow who, I suppose, was looking over the ground for a position for his regiment, the 49th Virginia, as it subsequently took position to our left, and finally united in one of the charges upon Griffin's battery. Colonel Cummings and Lieutenant Colonel Lee were in the front of our regiment, perhaps 100 yards, stooping down and occasionally staying over to get a view of the crest of the hill, there as gently before us, low over 100 yards. The musketry kept up on our right, and then Colonels Cummings and Lee were seen to rise, and bending down to come back and somewhat quicken step to the regiment. I remember as Colonel Cummings drew near, he called, "Boys, they're coming. Now wait until they get close before you fire." Almost immediately, several pieces of artillery, their horses in front, made their appearance on the hill, in front of us, curving as if going into battery. And at the same time I desired the spear point of an upper portion of the United States flag, as it rose in the hands of its bearer over the hill. Then I saw the bearer, and the heads of the men composing the lines of battle, to the right and left of him. At the sight of several of our men rose from the ranks, leveled their muskets at the line, and although I called out, "Do not fire yet," it is of no use. They fired, and then the shrill cry of Colonel Cummings was heard, "Charge!" and away the regiment went, firing as they ran, into the ranks of the enemy, and particularly the battery toward which our line rapidly approached. Although bearing a non-commissioned officer's sword, I had obtained a cartridge box, belted it on, and in some way secured a flintlock musket, with which one of our companies was armed. This gun, after 2 futile efforts, I fired at a man on horseback in the battery, one of the drivers, I think. I got near enough to the battery to see that it was thoroughly disabled, horses and men falling, and our line driving ahead, when I felt the sting of a bullet tearing a piece from my side, just under my cartridge box, which I had pulled well round to the right in front of my waist. I called out that I was wounded to my uncle, Frank Jones, who helped me up on his horse and carried me to the rear. So we have Griffin and Ricketts both taking fire. Famously, there's a debate, and we kind of talked about this the first time we talked about this battle. There's a debate amongst them as to whether the oncoming men are going to be Confederates or Union men. They're kind of coming from the direction of their support, so that kind of makes sense, where some of them are like, well, this is obviously the supporting regiment, and they're wearing blue, mostly blue, so that's why there is some confusion here. The 11th, along with remnants of the 1st Minnesota, would be broken by artillery and infantry fire, but in their withdrawal, the Confederate cavalry would see an opportunity to maybe check them, as perhaps their moves were deemed a flanking attempt. Jeb Stuart and his 1st Virginia Cavalry would launch a charge to remove the 11th New York as an option for support. We have an account of their part of the action as well. This is going to be from William Blackford. Half the distance was passed before they saw the avalanche coming upon them. But then they came to a front face. A long line of bright muskets was leveled. A sheet of red flame gleamed, and we could see no more. Captain Welby Carter's horse sprang forward and rolled over dead, almost in front of Comet, so that a less active animal would have been thrown down. But Comet recovered himself and cleared the struggling horse and his rider. Smoke which wrapped them from out of our sight also hissed from them. I'm thinking perhaps that we had been swept away by the volley, and instead of coming to a charged bayonet, lowered their pieces to load, and the position we struck them. The tremendous impetus of horses at full speed broke through and scattered their line like chaff before the wind. As the scarlet line appeared through the smoke, when within a couple of horses' lengths of them, I leaned down with my carbine, cocked a thumb on the hammer and forefinger on the trigger, and fixed my eye on a tall fellow I saw would be one of my course, and had placed in the right position for the carbine, while the man next to him in front of the horse I could have to leave to Comet. I then plunged the spurs into Comet's flanks, and he evidently thought I wanted him to jump over the strange-looking wall I was riding him at. For he rose to make a leap, and he was too close and going too fast to rise higher than the breast of the man, and he struck him full in the chest, rolling him over and over under his hoofs, and knocking him about 10 feet backwards, depriving him of all further interest in the subsequent proceedings, and knocking the rear rank man to one side. As Comet rose to make the leap, I leaned down from the saddle, rammed the muzzle of my carbine into the stomach of my man, and pulled the trigger. I could not help feel a little sorry for the fellow as he lifted his handsome face to mine while he tried to get his bayonet up to meet me, but he was too slow, for the carbine blew a hole as big as my arm clear through him. Now, much is made of this charge in particular. There are several accounts of the 11th New York that say that very few of their number actually become casualties. In fact, Stuart's horsemen might have got the worst of it, with the fire squads turning and firing on them, and a counterstrike by some regulars also making some casualties for the rebels. But much in the same way that you have Jackson's legend start, you also probably need to have Jeb Stuart's legend begin as well, and that's, possibly part of why you have a lot of fanfare with this cavalry charge. At a second major instance of the day, the lack of all one-color uniforms would prove to be a problem. The 33rd Virginia was mostly equipped with blue uniforms and a mix of civilian clothing. They advanced toward their batteries, which would hold their fire, as they are unsure if it was friend or foe. Charles Griffin and William Averill would both believe them to be the enemy, but Heintzelman was not sure. The 14th Brooklyn had been sent to maybe flank the rebel position, and so it was possible that this was going to be them. A volley would take out many of the battery members, and also the horses that would be able to haul the pieces away. Now this we've already actually mentioned with the 33rd Virginia engaging the batteries. But the point is that the Union troops are not going to be willing to just throw away valuable cannon. 2 Massachusetts regiments from Franklin's brigade would advance and briefly take back the batteries, will be charged by Jackson, holding true to his promise to give them the bayonet. The 1st Minnesota and 1st Michigan would also take their turns gaining the batteries before being thrown back by counterattacks. At one point, the 1st Michigan was supposed to have been the most advanced position for the Union Army, clinging to part of Henry House Hill. Part of the success for several of these regiments would be that even broken units could leave pockets of men on the field. Some of the more courageous who were not willing to be in retreat. Sherman would press his brigade into the fight, but his regiments too would be thrown back. Simon Cameron's brother, leading the 79th New York, would be killed in this fighting. Unfortunately for Sherman, the leading tactical thought was that the brigade-sized formations were harder to control. Therefore, he would deploy each regiment almost one at a time. They would all become confused at who was a friendly and who was not. Remember, they're not really communicating well with either in a battle situation, a combat situation. They're probably not communicating, rightfully so, very well. So each of them are experiencing the same thing that the other regiments are already experiencing. There's no shared knowledge. So if you have the lead regiment who, we're taking fire from these guys to the left, we found out that they're not friendlies, but they're wearing blue, or, we're wearing gray, or what have you. Each of the regiments is going to experience it one at a time. There's no taking of control of the situation, and there's no shared knowledge. Jackson's line was being reinforced by troops that had been on the rebel right. This would be around the time that Bernard B. would be mortally wounded trying to lead remnants of his command back into the fray. Already Bartow had met the same fate, these attempts almost being suicidal. The 38th New York, commanded by Hobart Ward, would see some success along with the Irish. At one point, the 69th New York would claim to part of the hill, and McDowell would actually join them, congratulating them on winning the day. But the day, in fact, was not won. McDowell's troops would essentially be spent. He had thrown all his available infantry into the fighting, but the Confederates still had some reinforcements not yet seen action. As it was, a concentrated effort to dislodge the Union troops from their foothold on Henry House Hill had succeeded, cobbled together commands being used for this purpose. Kirby Smith would make it to the field, and so too would Jubal Early, albeit fairly late in the action, leading to the question of what exactly his role in the final outcome was. Kirby Smith had actually commandeered Elzey's brigade, leading it personally against the Chinn Ridge defense. In this action, Smith would have a ball pass through his shoulder, leading Elzey to exclaim, "God is just, Smith is dead," obviously slighted at his brigade being taken. Also kind of gives you an idea of what kind of guy Kirby Smith was, a little bit. His command, though, would engage with the final card that McDowell had to play in Oliver Howard's brigade of Maine and Vermont regiments. Howard really did not stand a chance, being hit by fire from many sides before joining the rest of the Union troops in retreat. We have an account of the line collapsing. When under the orders to retire began to crest the form, those who were left began quietly to retreat. They would not halt. They saw no army on our side, only irregular masses of men without order. One captain walked by for some time my horse and shed tears because he no longer had any command. "They will not stay together. They will not obey me," he said. So the panic began everywhere. Some officers pled and threatened. Surgeons pointed to the wounded and begged, "For God's sakes, stop, don't leave us." When nothing could influence our hosts now except such cries as, "The enemy is upon us, we shall be taken." My command there at Centerville was brought into fair order. It had, curiously enough, followed the route of the morning, around the loop of 7 miles. An old and experienced officer says that defeat was the best thing that could have happened to us, for it humbled us and made us better prepared, which led, in time, to the final victory. After the complete breakup near the crossing of Bull Run, Heintzelman, with his wounded arm in a sling, rode up and down trying to restore order. He spoke to me sharply and told me to reform my lines. He did the same to other brigade and regiment commanders. My brother, C.H. Howard, whenever I was disposed to relax my effort, said, "Do try again." Once we noticed the 18th Brooklyn marching in regular column. As we all moved back on the Sudley Road, some 3 or 4 companies reorganized and tramped handsomely. My brother said, "See there, let us try to form them like that." So we did, but all in vain. One foolish cry, following a team of horses thundering along through our ranks, "The Black Horse Cavalry are upon us," sent the Brooklyn men, and all others in disorder, and into the neighboring woods. Some regulars and Sherman's brigade would be orderly in their retreat, but the Union soldiers would move back in the directions they had come. Sykes' regulars were actually briefly deploying square at the prospect of Stuart falling on the rear. In many places, the retreat would be orderly. With the limited roads they were used to get into the field, the presence of at least some civilians would be an issue in getting away from the potential Confederate pursuit. The magnitude of the civilians watching the battle has been a tad blown out of proportion, though. There was at least a minor effort by various Confederate units to get at the Federals, including some units of cavalry who would capture valuable arms and cannon, including a 30-pound piece. Overall, though, the Confederates were not really in the best position to capitalize on their victory. Ironically, this is probably the best time for them to win the war, arguably. Whether the defense of Washington was truly prepared to receive an attack is questionable. Whether the Confederates were up to the task is likewise questionable. Longstreet would be among those officers who was a little disappointed at the lack of follow-up. Reportedly, he would say that they could have at least whittled more out of the command, falling on the retreating enemy as they made their way back to Centerville. McDowell would wire Washington to protect the city as he could not control the troops. Interesting quote would write that the rebels could have just formed a line and fired shots into the air, and they would have racked up prisoners in droves. As it was, 2,000 Confederates had become casualties, 387 killed, 1,582 wounded, and 13 missing. The North had lost 460 killed, 1,124 wounded, and 1,312 missing or captured. Rebels had obtained 27 pieces of artillery and some 500 rifled muskets discarded by the Union troops. But what exactly can we make of the battle? Well, there are a lot of weird opportunities. McDowell would have greatly helped by more professional troops. The best unit on the day was that of George Sykes, albeit with some good work by a couple of volunteer regiments. Patterson does him a huge disservice by not holding down Johnson. Without Bee, Bartow, Jackson, and Kirby Smith, then the battle becomes very different. Even then, his lack of experience in leading an army, and a much larger army than, say, 1812 or the War with Mexico, was on display, as he does not press the attack following Matthews Hill. McDowell is going to pay the price, and as cliche as it is to sound, the war is going to continue for years instead of days. We can indeed really say that the first battle of Bull Run was something different than anything that Americans had seen up until that point. Hopefully this was a better look at the Battle of First Manassas. I, for one, am more satisfied at this effort to really talk about the first major engagement of the war. Next time, we're going to go back to our analysis series for key generals, and this time we're going Union, and it makes sense to start first with Sam Ulysses S. Grant. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.